Hello, my name is Christina. Today I will be giving a presentation on women's rights in the developing world, that is, the Middle East, specifically focusing on Saudi Arabia as a case study. In 1985, Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen defined women's agency as what a woman is free to do and achieve in pursuit of whatever goals or values she regards as important. At present, major international commitments on gender equality in academic research have sought to define and measure agency as a means of women's empowerment in developing countries. Since 1948, the promotion of women's rights and education as part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been a core U.S. foreign policy value. Most governments have signed the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, but enforcement remains a problem. At the center of this conflict is the dilemma of women's human rights, whether women's rights are important beyond a moral right to equality, and if there's a reason to focus on women's rights rather than human rights more generally. Although many Muslim countries have ratified CEDAW, their legal codes clearly conflict with the convention. This is perhaps nowhere more apparent than in Saudi Arabia, where the empowerment of women is one of the central issues in the process of development today. Saudi Arabia is known to be one of the most conservative regimes in the world, but Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been making great advances towards women's rights. Should the United States promote women's rights in developing countries? Scholar Isabel Coleman takes the position of a proponent of the normative questions, arguing that women's rights are inherently connected with human rights. On the other hand, scholar Marcia E. Greenberg represents a political realist, making the counter-argument that while it should be a priority for the United States to promote women's rights in general, the notion of aggressively promoting women's rights in developing countries is, rather than being rights-based, a rights-focused approach, which may cause more losses for women than gains, and promotion may be counterproductive. While some progress has been made in recent years in terms of political enfranchisement, While some progress has been made in recent years in terms of political enfranchisement and entry into the workforce, the social and educational gender gap is wide. 781 million adults in the world are illiterate, and more than two-thirds of them are women. According to the 2005 UNDP Human Development Report, the world is facing a shortfall in the predicted number of primary school-age girls in developing nations, by which the UN Millennium Development Goal of universal primary education will not be met if current trends continue. As we can see from this infographic, in 2002 there were 5 million primary school-age girls not enrolled in school in Arab states, clearly overshooting the UNDP goal of 3.5 million by 2015 and creating a shortfall of 0.5 million. These findings have important practical implications. Education is crucial for enhancing and facilitating women's well-being. Amartya Sen makes a compelling argument that women's education strengthens women's agency, in this case, female literacy. While the number of literate people has dropped over the past decade, UNESCO Institute for Statistics data shows that youth literacy rates remain low, particularly for girls in Arab states, where, as we can see in the first infographic, 2015, just 88% of girls are literate, compared to 93% of boys and the 90% total. Gender disparities remain large in several regions, but the disparities become even more apparent when examining the Gender Parity Index, or GPI, in the second infographic, which is calculated by dividing the female by the male literacy rate. To be sure, Arab states are far from gender parity. At the global level, women aged 15 years and older are 9% less likely to be literate than men, and young women between 15 and 24 years of age are 4% less likely to be literate. Although some inroads have been made, projections show that EFA literacy goal, thereby underscoring the need for a new literacy goal which is even more ambitious in its current context. And this is a map graphic showing each scholar's arguments on the effects of gender inequality. It's more meant to analogically illustrate this in a more coherent summary type form. According to the World Bank and Gendering Development Report, there is a strong negative association between mothers' average schooling and child mortality. Coleman maintains that since high fertility often exacerbates the problems associated with poverty. Educating women and realizing lower fertility rates is an important step in ending the vicious cycle of poverty in developing countries. Greenberg argues that in countries like Bin Salman, Saudi Arabia, the legal system may actually enforce laws that violate women's rights, such as prohibiting women from traveling without a male relative's permission. Sen has drawn the world's attention to the socially generated excess mortality of women in Asia and North Africa of 100 million missing women, that is, missing in the sense of being as a result of gender distribution of healthcare and education. The problem of gender discrimination and of cultural preferences for male children has led to the abuse and neglect of female children across the world. This has become known as the missing woman problem, in which there is a shortfall in the number of women relative to the expected number of women in a region or country. The phenomenon was first noted by Amartya Sen in an essay in the New York Review of Books in 1990. Sen originally estimated that more than 100 million women were missing. Sen makes the case that the missing woman problem is unquestionably important for the well-being of women and in understanding the unequal treatment of women. Beyond a moral right to equality, there is considerable evidence to suggest that taking an agent-oriented approach to the women's rights agenda and promoting universal education helps to remove the iniquities that depress the well-being of women. So, why should we promote women's rights? Coleman's argues consistent with Sen's empirical research demonstrating that fertility rates tend to go down with greater empowerment of women. For example, a comparative study of nearly 300 districts within India found that women's education and women's employment are the two most important influences in fertility rates, particularly in the context of the nature and severity of the world population problem, as Sen calls it. Women's education and literacy improves the health and survival of both the mother and the child. There is considerable evidence that women's education tends to reduce child mortality rates. Higher levels of women's literacy and labor force participation are strongly associated with lower levels of relative female disadvantage in child survival. Similarly, women's agency and empowerment appear to have a strong influence in reducing the much observed gender bias in child survival. The negative connection between women's literacy and fertility appears to be, on the whole, empirically well-founded. Murphy, Guo, and Dreze's 1995 statistical analysis indicates that, in quantitative terms, female literacy has a significant reducing impact on under 5 mortality. For instance, an increase in the crude female literacy rate from 22% to 75% reduces the predicted value of under 5 mortality for males and females combined, from 156 per thousand to 110 per thousand. Murphy et al. Found that the powerful effects of female literacy contrasts with the comparatively ineffective roles of male literacy or general poverty reduction as instruments of child mortality reduction. Women's education is critical for economic productivity and growth. According to Lawrence Summers, the chief economist of the World Bank, during the early 1990s, investing in girls' education is the highest return investment available in the developing world. David Kutsira, a labor economist at the International Labor Organization, has found that gender equality in education improves foreign direct investment, or FDI, in poor countries. Promoting universal education improves the economic trajectory of developing countries. Women play an important part. Advocates for the United States to provide more economic opportunities for women in developing countries, contending that there is considerable evidence that when women get the opportunities that are less typically the preserve of men, they are no less successful in making use of these facilities that men have claimed to be their own for centuries. The relationship between Islam and women's rights has been and remains politically contingent. Saudi Arabia has always been predominantly focused on oil, but over the past 60 years, plentiful oil income allowed the state to build an extensive cradle-to-coffin welfare system, but the population is growing rapidly and oil prices have dropped severely over the years. With this in mind, in April 2016, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman announced a strategic program known as Saudi Vision 2030, which aims to transform the economy from one dependent primarily on oil revenue to a post-oil economy. Women play an important part in Vision 2030. As part of his development plan, bin Salman has reopened movie theaters, opened the first Saudi sports stadium to admit women, and most notably ended the kingdom's legal ban on female drivers. As women increase their numbers within the kingdom's labor pool, some will inevitably replace foreign workers. Aided by increased mobility, the health sector, as the second most popular employment sector for women in Saudi Arabia's gender-segregated labor market, should provide significant opportunity for increased female employment. This is a short legislative history of women's rights in the developing world. In 1948, the promotion of women's rights in education is established as part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and as a core of U.S. foreign policy value. In 1979, the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women is adopted. In 2007, education had become a national security issue, so much so that in May 2007, Congress introduced an Education for All bill that would increase U.S. funding for primary education in the developing world to $10 billion over the next 5 years. In 2016, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman announced his Saudi Vision 2030. Thank you for watching and listening.